The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content. Listener discretion is advised.
Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome, everyone.
I don't know how many of you wanderers out there have seen the latest UFO news, but there's been a recent sighting of UFOs in Palmdale, California. And here's what one news reporter had tweeted. Breaking. A wave of panic is sweeping throughout the community as numerous people report witnessing UFOs in the sky. Eyewitnesses are claiming to have seen not just one, but 6 flying saucers darting and zigzagging across the night sky, defying all logic. The eerie spectacle has left residents stunned and authorities scrambling for answers. In a startling turn of events, numerous people in Palmdale and Lancaster areas of California are reporting an influx of UFO sightings. The Ring neighborhood apps are buzzing with eyewitness accounts that defy explanation. One witness described seeing what they initially thought was a shooting star until it suddenly halted midair and began zigzagging across the sky. Another person, visibly shaken, recounted, "I was just walking my dog in the backyard when I noticed a bright light in the sky. To my utter shock, it was a hovercraft." Yet another chilling account read, "After hearing a neighbor report a UFO, my mom and I rushed outside to see for ourselves. Within 10 minutes, we counted 6 strange objects. We couldn't say for sure that they were flying saucers, but it was beyond eerie." Authorities and law enforcement are now actively investigating these unnerving reports.
It was pretty wild, and it made international news within like 24 hours. But I was thinking that since Palmdale has a military aircraft manufacturing plant, they'll probably explain it in some ridiculous way, rather than tell the truth about whatever they were.
Yeah, I'm not sure what they're going to say. Hopefully it doesn't come back as swamp gas. But I'm definitely awaiting to see what the report does say.
Well, the videos, if that's swamp gas, it's the most amazing swamp gas ever recorded in the history of humankind.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible.
It is.
I mean, I looked at them, and some of them actually look like the police light bar on top of the car.
Yeah.
And it does look like flashing police lights or first responder lights. But other ones that I've seen, they look rather peculiar to me.
Mm-hmm.
So they do raise your eyebrow thinking, okay, this is something strange,
mm-hmm.
but is it man-made or is it something alien foreign to us? Who knows? But I can't wait to see more about it.
Hopefully there will be more. You know who tends to cover things more truthfully, I guess you could say, are the international papers, like the papers out of the UK.
Well, this was from a UK journalist.
Yeah, I saw that one, but I also saw a report in a newspaper from India.
Yes, I saw that one too.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. There's been a lot going on this week with UFO sightings, and then there's the Conjuring House, which we probably won't get into saying anything about in this episode, but next week, probably talk a little bit about the Conjuring House and what's going on there before we get into that episode.
Yeah.
Because it's quite bizarre.
There's a lot going on there, too.
There's going to be a lot between this recording and
next week.
Yeah. I'm sure that's going to come to light.
Yeah.
All right, so before we get into tonight's episode, we just want to remind everyone to check out our merch on our website. If you're looking for t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, pillows, stickers, we have all of that.
And if you're looking for some good books to read, we have a few in our bookstore that range from creepy tales to sci-fi to historical fiction.
So all you have to do is go to our website, wheremindswander.com, and you can find the links to everything right there.
All in one convenient place.
Woohoo! That's the way it should be. All right, Beth, why don't you tell everyone where your mind wandered for this episode?
Okay, so we've covered a lot of Bigfoot encounters on our show.
Have we?
Yes, we have, from the very beginning. And some of them, like the rock apes of Vietnam, are very credible. And others, like the case of Albert Ostman, he was the Canadian man who claimed to have been kidnapped by a whole family of Bigfoots. That was a little more out there. But for tonight's episode, I have to say, I found a Bigfoot story that is pretty recent and very credible. The write-up on the BFRO website was the longest and most detailed write-up I have ever seen. And so, since it's pretty recent and kind of scary, I thought it was perfect as a lead-up to our annual trip to the Whitehall Sasquatch Festival in September. But I should also preface it by saying that I keep calling it recent because it happened in 2000. But I don't know about you, but for me, the year 2000 seems like it was just 10 years ago. You know?
Yeah.
So, for those of you listening that may be in your 20s, you might be thinking, I wasn't even born yet in 2000. But for us, 2000 wasn't that long ago. Okay, so let me get into the story. In mid-January of 2000, the BFRO website, the Bigfoot Field Research Organization, received the following email. Quote, "Too many incidents to mention here. Please have someone contact us. This is no hoax, and my brother is afraid for his family. This creature is getting bolder every time it returns. This thing is huge, walks upright, smells like a musky urine burned hair type odor. He repeatedly comes back in the early morning hours after midnight and harasses them until just before dawn. It has on more than one occasion tried to enter their home. We don't know where to turn. Everyone thinks we are crazy when we mention it. Please, we don't know what to do, but I do know that something needs to be done." End quote. The email had come from a man in Oklahoma, and this one family's Bigfoot encounter became known as the Siege of Honobia. Originally a Choctaw settlement, Honobia, Oklahoma is incredibly remote. The nearest grocery store is 55 miles away. Nestled in the Kiamichi Mountains, it sits on the border between Lafleur County and Pushmataha County in the southeastern part of the state. Looking at pictures online, it resembles the Adirondacks, where we live. There's lots of forest stretching for thousands of acres and mountain peaks all around, so basically it's the perfect spot for a Bigfoot. It was around 1998 when Tim Humphreys, a lifelong resident of the area, began hearing strange whistling and even screaming in the woods near his house. This was followed by what they described as tree thrashing. Tim and his wife chose to ignore these weird noises, or perhaps ignore isn't the right word. They decided to act as though it wasn't happening. Except whatever the animal was, it became increasingly bolder, coming closer and closer to their house. When the animal managed to steal 3 complete quartered deer from a chest-high freezer in their shed, that's when they decided that they couldn't ignore it any longer. especially since whatever this animal was, it was now coming up on their porch at night. It banged on the outside of their house, scratched at their windows, and even tried turning the locked doorknob on their front door.
So it's stealing frozen meat.
Yeah.
That's odd.
Yeah. And then coming up to the house and banging on the door like, can I have some more, please?
Well, I'm thinking perhaps they were hoping that they would cook it for them.
Oh, maybe. Bigfoot barbecue party.
Well, why not?
Well, whatever this animal was, because they weren't calling it a Bigfoot yet, it was so bold that it actually tore the wood from their window casings in an attempt to get inside their house. According to an Oklahoman.com article, Sooners Tracking Bigfoot, from January of 2000, things really came to a head when the Humphreys' 3-year-old daughter watched terrified as this creature came close enough to the house to stare through the window at her. Tim Humphreys said, quote, "They had been beating on my house, scaring my kids playing in the woods, yelling and screaming and scratching," end quote. And then he saw the animal, and there wasn't just one, but 4 of them. He aimed his shotgun and fired, and as they ran away unharmed, the realization that they were Bigfoots couldn't be denied any longer. This was about the time Tim's brother, Michael, contacted the BFRO. He was the one who wrote the email that I read at the top of my story. The BFRO sent out 3 investigators, Roger, Miles, and Roger's father. Roger was a former police officer, private investigator, and military vet who served during Vietnam. His father was a lifelong hunter. According to the BFRO, when the 3 men arrived, the Humphreys showed them a recent deer kill. The deer had no bullet wounds. Instead, one of its legs had been twisted and broken. But what really alarmed them was that something had opened the deer between its neck and rib cage and somehow managed to pull out every single one of its internal organs through the hole. They said it was as if a creature had reached in with its entire arm and just pulled everything out. At this point, out of fear for their safety, Humphreys had sent his children to stay with a relative, so it was just him and his wife at the house. When the armed BFRO researchers arrived, Mrs. Humphreys also left the property. Tim Humphreys warned the BFRO researchers that if any Bigfoot came close to his house ever again, he'd shoot to kill. Rogers and Miles trekked out to a nearby cave where another witness had claimed to have seen a Bigfoot-like creature, but they didn't find anything conclusive. They returned to the house where Roger's father, Tim Humphreys, and his brother Michael had stood guard all day. And then, basically, all hell broke loose. That evening, a rainstorm pounded the Kiamichi Mountains, and Tim Humphreys turned on the spotlight that illuminated his yard. To their astonishment, the Humphreys' house was surrounded by what all the men described as Bigfoot. Tim and Michael fired shot after shot at the creatures, trying desperately to scare them off for good. When questioned by the BFRO headquarters if the 2 men could have possibly gotten caught up in the moment and been shooting at raccoons or some other creature, Roger replied that no, it was serious business and that, quote, "they've definitely got a problem here," end quote. When dawn broke, an explanation began to make sense to the researchers. For years, Tim Humphreys had been taking advantage of the huge deer population on his property by shining spotlights into his yard. As the deer came into the yard and were caught in the light, Tim would shoot them.
Oh, that's just wrong. That's unsportsmanlike.
Well, it created a problem in other ways. The researchers suggested that since so many deer got away wounded, that the Bigfoot in the area also thought it was a great spot to hunt for deer. It was a lot easier for them to pick off a wounded deer than an unhurt one, and so the Bigfoot had congregated there for the easy pickings.
Well, good for them.
I love it.
Well, how bad of a shot was this guy?
Well,
I mean, come on. You've got spotlights on a deer. You should be able to take him out.
I don't know, but their feeling was that when Tim had stopped hunting for the season, the Bigfoot were a little ticked off that their easy meal ticket had disappeared.
Well, I don't feel sorry for Tim at this point.
Well,
perhaps maybe what he should do, shoot some deer, roast them up, do some venison and lay him out for the Bigfoot far away from his home.
Would they eat cooked venison?
Well, they'll eat frozen venison.
Well, yeah, I guess.
Supposedly.
Well, the spotlight deer theory never really had a chance to be proven or disproven because from what I could tell from the sources that I looked at, the Humphreys left the property soon after, mostly because they were tired of being ridiculed by people who chose not to believe them. But that wasn't it for Honobia. A 2007 article published in the Oklahoman titled Constant Sasquatch Watch Held in Honobia, that was a lot,
It was a mouthful.
implied that the Bigfoot sightings were still happening, quite a lot. Hairy ape-like creatures were being seen, and strange screams and chatter were still being heard all throughout the area. Now, keep in mind, like I'd said, Honobia is really remote. Most of the people who live there are second and third generation loggers, hunters, and all-around woodsmen. In the article, retired logger and former state forestry employee Harold Yates stated that there was, quote, something out there that he couldn't explain. He didn't form his opinion just on his neighbor's stories, but his very own encounter. He was building a cabin on Little River in 2005, and as he sawed planks of wood, he could hear something perfectly mimicking the sound of the saw blade cutting through the wood. Then, later, in the middle of the night, he heard the sound of something throwing very large boulders into the river, one after another. He said this went on for a full 40 minutes, to the point that it totally freaked out his family. Yates also weighed in on the Humphreys encounter, saying Tim had told him that the creatures would communicate with each other with all kinds of grunts and gibberish. When one of the Bigfoot charged at Tim one night, he did shoot at it. He said it shrieked an eerie wail and took off running. He was too afraid to run after it, since he could hear other Bigfoot communicating with it. Yates said he saw the blood splatter from the wounded Bigfoot himself, and it was 9 feet up, spread out along several tree trunks. Apparently, another logger told Tim Humphreys that he'd seen 2 Bigfoot carrying a third one across the road. He said the man turned around 6 times to drive back and forth along the same stretch of road, just because he couldn't believe what he had just seen. In the same article, logger Randall Wright told about some tracks he discovered in the woods. He said they were 15¼ inch long and 7 inches wide. Although he hadn't seen the animal that left the 5-toed footprints, he did plan on shooting the creature if he ever did see it. Charlene Cusher, a Choctaw from the town of Watson, told the Oklahoman that Bigfoot stories have always been part of Choctaw legends. And perhaps the stories weren't all legends, but true. She recalled one time when her grandparents told her a little boy had gone missing. When the boy was finally found, safe and sound, he said, quote, "That thing took care of him." And Billy Ludlow, also a Choctaw, said he saw a Bigfoot when he was 11. He and some friends were playing by an unfinished bridge on the Little River when they suddenly heard metal bars snapping. They looked up to see a bipedal creature. Ludlow said, quote, "I looked up and saw this large, hairy animal stand up on 2 legs like a man. I'd guess it to be 9 or 10 feet tall, with broad shoulders and hair all over. I was always the slowest runner among my friends, but on that night I was the fastest." End quote. Fox7Austin.com reported back in 2021 that Oklahoma Representative Justin Humphrey, no relation to Tim Humphreys, had pushed a bill that offered $2.1 million to anyone who could capture Bigfoot. House Bill 1648 would have required the Oklahoma Wildlife Conservation Commission to create rules for a Bigfoot hunting season in the state. There would be license fees, kind of like a fishing license, and specific dates that the Bigfoot hunting needed to follow. And the legislation was very clear. No Bigfoot was to be shot at, wounded, or killed. So all those men that said they were going to take shots at it would have been out of luck.
Good.
Yes. So the legislation said they could not shoot at, wound, or kill a Bigfoot, and they would only get the $2.1 million award if they brought one in unharmed. Obviously, Humphrey was hoping to bring some tourism to his state, or at least that's what he said his reasoning was. Needless to say, the bill didn't pass. Honobia did hold an annual Bigfoot festival. This summer would actually have been their 18th year. However, the Christian mission, which allowed the festival to be held on their land, canceled this year's event. The Siege of Honobia might just be one of the most unnerving Bigfoot encounter stories that I'd never heard of before.
Yeah, I've never heard about it.
No.
And we've listened to a lot of shows on Bigfoot.
And it wasn't that long ago.
No, it wasn't that long ago, and I'm surprised we had never heard about it before.
No.
But I do agree, nobody should be shooting at Bigfoot.
No.
We've heard so many stories about young children that have gotten lost out in the wilderness, only to be taken in and looked after by some creature that, we think is Bigfoot.
Yeah, and there was one not that long ago. I think we mentioned it on the show that the kid had said that some sort of creature had taken care of him or whatever.
Yeah.
He was missing for like 4 days.
Quite a few episodes back.
Yeah.
And I think Dave Paulides also kind of, what would you say?
Alludes to it?
Yes.
Yeah.
He does allude to it. But, yeah, I don't believe in... Why do we always have to try to destroy something that we just don't understand?
Well, I think when it's coming up on your porch and rattling your doorknob and pulling the wood casings off your window and you can hear them surrounding your house chattering and yelling and screaming, I could see where you might want to.
Be quite fearful, yes.
Yeah.
But I don't think that warrants shooting it until it comes into the house and makes an aggressive move on you.
When it flings open the door and says, "I'm here."
Right.
I don't know. Maybe we'll have to agree to disagree on that one.
I guess you just have to be put in that situation. But from where I'm sitting right now, I just wouldn't do it.
Safe inside your studio on the 3rd floor of a house in the middle of a city.
Correct. Hey, We've got plenty of wildlife around here. We have bears in the city. We have a ton of foxes and raccoons out back. I mean, we're in the city, but we're surrounded by rivers and lakes.
And farms.
Right.
And woods.
And we see all kinds of strange stuff here.
Well, that's
Hell,
true.
we just saw a weasel run down the sidewalk the other night when we were out on the deck.
Well, that's true. We did.
Enjoying the night air.
Yes, we did.
How many weasels do you see running down a sidewalk?
Up the driveway.
And then we have our resident woodchuck
Yes.
and groundhog.
Yes.
They're cute as all hell.
They are cute.
Now, if he started charging at me, I wouldn't shoot him.
Well, no, you just laugh and step out of the way. They're not very imposing. Their bellies slap the ground when they run.
Well, they are funny as all hell when you go out to the car and he just sits up and looks at you with those big-ass teeth.
Yes.
It's almost like a smile.
I...
He just waddles off.
Yes. He's not a Bigfoot. Towering over you.
Well, I guess that all depends on your state of mind. If you go out there after you've had a couple glasses of moonshine and that spotlight from the back porch is shining onto it.
And it creates a shadow across the back fence or something.
With that groundhog standing up. Could look pretty big.
Anyway, we'll be right back after this quick break. Hey, did you know? When the King and Queen of England came to the U.S. to meet with President Franklin Roosevelt in 1938, it was the first time a reigning British monarch had ever come to the United States. And so, Roosevelt wanted to treat them to a classic all-American day. He invited them to his home in Hyde Park, New York, where they lounged by the pool, drank beer, and dined on a culinary treat the royals had never had before: hot dogs. When presented with the strange meat, the Queen picked up her knife and fork and asked, quote, "How do you eat this?" King George, however, enjoyed the meal so much that he came back for more, making sure to wash down his dog with a nice cold beer. Who'da thunk it?
All right, we're back.
Yes, and what are you going to be talking about tonight? Where did your mind wander?
Well, for those of you wanderers who are probably new to our show, Beth and I often say that we would have loved to see New York City during the 1800s. So many of the photographs from that time show dapperly dressed men in their three-piece suits carrying their walking sticks. You can almost see the shine of the pocket watch tucked into their vest pockets, and the women in their bustled silk or satin gowns, their high feathered hats, and their parasols. The architecture in the city was so impressive because you could see each building for how perfect it was without having another building crammed right beside it. It was easy to admire a building when the streets were uncrowded by other competing buildings. And as dusk fell, the street lamps were lit, and the horse-drawn carriages rumbled past, creating a sort of background music for your evening. Couples walked along the streets on their way to a restaurant for dinner or perhaps a night at the theater. Young ladies hurried home from the corner market stall with fresh bread and vegetables in their baskets. Men hurried home from the office, hopping into a hansom cab, perhaps thinking about what might be waiting for them at home: their family, a warm fire, a filled tobacco pipe, a newspaper, perhaps a glass of bourbon. Looking back now, it seems like it would have been such a cool time period to live in. But if you look long enough at the pictures of New York City online from the late 1800s, you will probably come across some that show a completely different side of New York. I know, it's not surprising. Everyone has seen the photos of young children standing on street corners, their clothes tattered and their faces dirty. Life in the city wasn't very pleasant if you weren't rich, but that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm referring to are the photos that show what look like piles of dirt all along several city streets, as though the ground was just leveled in order to pave the road. But then you realize that a road already exists in the photo, and the piles of dirt, some as high as a couple feet, are strewn with what looks like boulders just left behind. Except they too look brown. So, what exactly are you looking at? Well, basically a bunch of horse shit. Mountains of horse shit. Hills of horse shit. Ruts made entirely out of horse shit. A street paved in never-ending, foot-deep, putrefying poop.
That sounds lovely.
Well, it wasn't. And I don't even have to be there to know that. Those couples walking down the street on their way to dinner, well, their shoes would be coated with it. The tip of the man's walking stick, slick with it. The hem of the ladies' gowns, crusted with it.
Oh, God.
Doesn't sound so romantic anymore, does it? Especially when I tell you that all the streets in the cities like New York looked like this at least some of the time. Because the truth is that most cities during the late 1800s had a horrible problem. And that's what I'm going to be telling you about tonight. The Manure crisis of 1894. For centuries, people have relied on horsepower for transportation, right? Well, as the world's major cities became more and more populated, there was a greater need for transportation. You couldn't just walk everywhere. And so cities came up with new, more convenient modes of transportation, like hansom cabs and horse-drawn buses. Hansom cabs were basically the original city taxi. They were a simple closed carriage, or cabriolet, with a driver who sat in a sprung seat behind and a little above the carriage. They were pulled by a single horse. They offered a decent amount of privacy and were very popular. Eventually, when mechanical taximeters were installed to keep track of fares, the name was changed to taxicab.
Oh. Now, see, we're not just spooky, we are informative. I did not know that.
But there were also horse-drawn buses, or the horse bus. Introduced in the 1820s, they became increasingly popular. Basically, it was a larger carriage, some were even double-decker, and could hold anywhere from 4 to 12 people, depending on their size. Picture a streetcar, and you kind of have the idea. Like streetcars, horse buses eventually ran alongside installed street rails to help the horses pull the weight more easily. Although horse buses only required 1 or 2 horses to pull it at a time, in a single day, one horse bus might change out its horses as many as a dozen times. Hansom cabs and horse buses were pretty convenient. People could get around the city much faster than on foot. According to historicuk.com, by the year 1900, there were 11,000 hansom cabs and several thousand horse-drawn buses in London, meaning that in just a single day, 55,000 horses were traveling throughout the city streets of London. And that's just public transportation. We haven't even talked about the number of personal horses. So think about that for a second. 55,000 horses a day. Horses are pretty free-spirited animals, and they're prone to just relieving themselves wherever they might be standing or walking or trotting. I mean, we've seen it before in plenty of pictures of tourist towns, that couple taking that buggy down, the scenic area of the city, and then the horse is just dumping manure behind it.
Just makes me think of Seinfeld and Kramer going, Rusty, as he was giving the horse beefarino or whatever.
Exactly. Horse farts.
Right.
We haven't even gotten to that, and I don't think we will in this episode.
Oh, we're going to save that for another episode.
Perhaps down the line. And when the average horse produces between 15 and 35 pounds of manure a day, well, you can see where this is going. Initially, this wasn't a problem. The cab drivers would make sure the manure was removed and stored in their stables. Then they'd sell it to the local farmers who were more than willing to take it. But as the supply quickly outweighed the demand, well, since there was nowhere else to put it, it stayed put. When it rained, puddles turned into poop soup. And then excrement mud.
Oh, lovely.
As you can imagine, flies arrived in droves, spreading all kinds of diseases, like typhoid fever. When the stagnant puddles dried up and the poop hills dried out, they turned into a fine dust, a dust that swirled all over the city, coating the buildings and the clothing of every person who walked by.
Ugh, you don't see that in the TV shows and the movies.
No, not at all.
Oh,
But if Londoners had it bad, New Yorkers had it much worse. According to the New Yorker magazine, by 1860, most of the city was traveling by horse-drawn streetcar. Within that decade, there was an estimated 35 million horse-car trips every single year. By 1870, there were 105 million horse-car trips a year. So that's a hell of a lot.
that's a lot.
Horse cars in New York could carry up to 20 people at a time and were pulled by a pair of horses if the route they were on was relatively flat. More strenuous routes required more horsepower, but even the 2-horse cars were changed out at least 4 times a day, so a single car could go through at least 8 different horses in a single day. And horses weren't just carrying passengers. There were all kinds of carts and wagons delivering goods all over the city. By 1880, there were an estimated 150,000 horses living and working in New York City, with each one producing an average of 22 pounds of horse manure a day. Altogether, that's around 2.2 million pounds a day. Or if you do the math, that's over 45,000 tons a month of just manure. And did I mention the 40,000 daily gallons of horse urine?
Ew. 40,000 gallons
Yep,
a day.
mixed with poop.
Oh, bleh.
But anyway, the New Yorker quoted George Waring Jr., the city's street cleaning commissioner and advocate of sewer drainage systems, as saying that Manhattan stunk with the emanations of putrefying organic matter. Someone else described the streets as literally carpeted with a warm brown matting smelling to heaven.
Ugh.
I know.
Ugh.
Not so romantic anymore, huh?
No.
I know when you look at the pictures, you just don't seem to see that. You see everything else around it, and it looks so perfect.
Yeah. Well, they all look so clean, too.
But they weren't.
No.
It was so bad, and I just want you to imagine this for a minute, that you couldn't go outside without stepping in it, dragging your dress through it. And if you dropped something, well, would you really want to pick it back up again? I mean, if you dropped your keys.
Your keys.
You know,
Your handkerchief. You just leave it there.
right? Your pocket watch.
Yeah.
Ugh. According to Atlas Obscura, by the late 1890s, once vacant lots in New York City now had piles of manure that were 40 to 60 feet high. Definitely not going sliding down it.
Yeah, it's a whole new meaning to sledding.
And then there was the problem of horse carcasses. You see, in the late 1800s, when a horse died, the city just left it there, wherever it may have laid down to die. They believed that a decaying carcass was much easier to cut up into pieces and remove, and so they'd leave it there until it dried up. So like I said, wherever it may have ended up, and that includes residential areas or a busy main street, it didn't really matter. They just left it there. Now, that caused a completely different set of problems, and it doesn't really figure into the manure problem. But I thought I'd mention it.
Gee, thanks.
Well, it's food for thought.
Oh, you could have picked a better phrase than that. Oh.
So, rather than trying to come up with solutions for getting rid of the horse manure, enterprising businessmen came up with better ways for people to deal with the problem. Boot scrapers. Boot scrapers had been in use since the 1600s, but during the late 1800s, they became a must for outside every house and establishment. You might not be able to avoid it outside, but you could scrape it off before you went inside. The designs varied, from the simple single bar of cast iron between two short uprights to fancier designs that included cast iron flowers or scroll work. Some stood just outside the front entrance to a home or business, while others were built into the front gate. Architects came up with an even better solution. Instead of entering directly from street level into a home or building, they began raising the first floor of a home and adding stone steps leading up to the entrance. This, at least, kept the muck a little further away from the front door. But it wasn't until 1894 in New York City that city officials really started to put their heads together to try and solve this doozy of a problem. Their decision to try and solve it all came from a single newspaper article. The Times newspaper printed a dire prediction that within 50 years, the city of London would be buried under 9 feet of manure. If London was doomed, well, what about New York? Someone suggested that perhaps the manure would reach New York City's third-story windows. Now, I can imagine that when they looked at those empty lots filled with poop mountains that high, well, I can see where they would think that.
Well, yeah, if it's filling the empty lot that high, how long is it going to be before it fills the entire street that high?
Right. Who wants to look out their third-story window and see a mountain of poop?
I would imagine no one.
The great horse manure crisis of 1894 had finally dawned on everyone. 4 years later in 1898, the very first urban planning conference was held in New York City. Delegates expected to meet for 10 days to discuss several issues facing the world's cities, but their top priority was the manure crisis. Top minds gathered to brainstorm solutions, but since horses were a needed part of daily life, and since more and more people were just going to keep coming to the cities, what could they do? More people meant more horses. That's just the way it was. Frustrated by their inability to come up with any sort of solution, they ended the conference completely after just 3 days. And so, they didn't do anything. It seemed as though the city streets, filled to the brim with horse shit, were just going to keep getting more full. But then, some other enterprising businessmen invented something new, like brothers Charles and Frank Duryea. Or you might recognize the names Carl Benz and Gottlieb Daimler. How about the name Henry Ford? And if you haven't guessed where I'm going with this, the automobile was invented. By 1912, just 4 years later, cars outnumbered horses in both London and New York City. 5 years later, in 1917, 2 horses pulled the very last New York City streetcar. So in came the automobile, and out went the poop puddles, the mountains of manure, and the need for boot scrapers in front of every home. But with that said, the people of New York like the looks of the steps leading up to their houses. So those have stuck around.
Who would have known that that's why they were invented? To keep the manure from
Going inside their homes.
going in their homes. I did not know that.
Well, that's the great thing about researching things. You find out new stuff all the time.
You do. Speaking of cool things, we used to have a boot scraper in front of my house when I was a teenager because the house was built in the 1800s. And my mom was always very worried that the grandchildren were going to somehow fall, trip over it or whatever, and get very hurt on the boot scraper. So I think my dad ended up removing it. And then, we kept it. We wouldn't, get rid of something like that. But we probably put it back in before we moved.
Well, if you haven't noticed, when we take our walks in the evening around the old base, there is, I believe it's the commander's house. There is a boot scraper outside on the first step.
They're so cool.
I know. I can't believe it's still there.
Yeah, that's true. Well, we have our horse hitching post in our front yard.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. You would think there would have been a boot scraper. Well, there probably was.
There probably
It's
was.
Just long gone. Yeah. Well, as always, if you would like to know more, you can always check our sources in our show notes for more information about Honobia or poop. Specific to New York City in 1894.
Right. Because if you just Google poop, you're going to come up with all kinds of things.
Right.
And if you haven't already, or if you've never seen any of the pictures of New York City, check it out. I think a lot of people wouldn't even notice it unless it's pointed out to them. That's piles of horse manure. And now that I think about it, I always see the old black and white photos. I wonder if anyone's done any colorization photos of back then.
Well, probably not, because then it would be extremely obvious what it is. Like, what color are you going to do it?
I don't know.
You know, you'd have to do it the accurate color, and then it would be very obvious.
But now it makes me want to put it into a paint program.
What is wrong with you?
Well, it's where my mind wandered.
What are you doing, honey? Painting some poop.
I'm going to go back and do a colorization of New York City.
There you go.
During the manure crisis.
Right.
My new project.
Oh, yay.
Just don't come bother me. I'm going to be very busy. I'll be hard at work.
I think it's time to wrap it up, dear.
All right. Join us again next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon.